So have you ever seen apps that do really custom animations and transitions, and you wondered how are they doing that? For example, Facebook, the old paper app that they used to support, and many other social media apps do this all the time. And then you go look in Xcode and you see options like cross dissolve and flip page and all these boring options, and you don't understand how can you do what they do. Well, in this tutorial, we are going to learn how to create custom view controller animations from scratch so that you have the ability to recreate any animation you want pretty much and achieve all those custom fancy flashy effects that you see on so many other big name apps. If you're a new developer and all this is a little too advanced for you, make sure you check out my iOS beginners course, available on both Skillshare and on Udemy. It's great for beginners. If you use my sign up link down below in the description, you'll get the course for 50% off. So let's open up Xcode and get started. So by the end of this tutorial, we're going to have built an app that is going to look like this in terms of how it operates in transitions. So these are custom view controller transitions. These are not stock transitions. And we're going to learn how to create the animations and tweak all the values so that we can customize everything about the animation. Different animations going forward, an animation going back. All right, so right now I've got the starter version of this project ready to go. And let me show you what it does right now currently. So it looks pretty similar as what we had at the beginning, but the animations have been stripped out because that's what we're going to implement in this tutorial. But if you go back, it's a dismiss. If you execute the transition, it's a modal presentation. And this is a really simple project. It's just two view controllers. And then the first view controller, all it does is a present to get to view controller 2. And view controller 2, all it does is hook up a table view, which is optional. You don't need to do it. I just did it to kind of have something to show on the second screen. But the key part is the dismiss. And so that's how we get back to the first view controller. So you can either hook those up in your own project or get access to the starter code for this tutorial. Either way, it's fine because the animations are what we're going to focus on next. So let's get started with that part now. So the next thing we're going to do is create a custom class called Animation Controller. You can just go into your project and add a new Swift file and name it Animation Controller, and that's how we'll start. So we need to understand what is responsible for actually creating those custom animations. And so what will happen is if we look at this protocol called UIViewController Animated Transitioning. So it's kind of a lot to say, but UIViewController Animated Transitioning. And I'm going to import UIKit because I believe it comes from there. And this protocol contains all of the functionality that we need to implement to do a lot of these animations. And there's a couple of methods in here that we're going to use. But basically, this is the starting point for doing a lot of the fancy custom work. And you can read through here if you're curious about what each method does and the parameters that they need. But let's go back to our class here, and let's just go ahead and build our project. And so right away, we're going to get an error message saying that we don't conform to the protocol NSObject protocol. And that's simple. We can just simply derive from NSObject and build again. And then we need to implement the protocol itself for view controller animated transitioning. So we'll let Xcode fix that for us. And now we've got the methods that we need. So there's two methods here, transition duration and animate transition using a context. And so these are the starting points for where we're going to implement the rest of our animation logic. But let's just start off with some basic housekeeping first. I'm going to actually move these into an extension. So I'm just going to do extension, animation controller, UIViewController, animated transitioning. It's going to implement those two protocol methods. We'll remove the redundant conformance from the top, and we should be good to go there. Now, going back to our actual class level here, let's go ahead and add some properties. So we're going to do a private let animation duration, which is a double, and then another variable, private let animation type, which is going to be an enum, and we haven't defined that yet, so you might get an error. And right below that, we'll define animation type. So enum animation type case present, case dismiss for the two kinds that we're going to support. So those are our properties, and we'll also get started with an initializer. So we'll do an init with animation duration and the animation type. Let's go ahead and assign those over. And we're good to go there. So now let's go back down to our protocol down below here and return back the time value. So what we'll do here is return back a time interval. And that's going to be exactly animation duration. And we'll default to 0 if this time interval returns nil or something goes horribly wrong. Let me just go ahead and build this. Verify. All right. It needs to be internal because it's an NS object. Okay, there we go. So we're good there. So we've got one method implemented. Now let's go down to the animate transition using the context. And so what we'll start off doing is getting an understanding of what this context is, essentially. So if we command click and jump to definition on this protocol, UIViewControllerContextTransitioning, it contains a few things. So there's a container view, which we're going to make use of. There's a couple other properties, such as is animated, is interactive, was the transition canceled, the modal presentation style, lots of things in here. So it just might be good to familiarize yourself with all of the methods and properties you can use here. But we're just going to use a couple of things. So the first thing we'll need to check for in here is our actual view controllers, our destination view controller, which one we want to go to, and the one that we're coming from. And so what we'll do is we'll try to get access to those being the very first thing that we do in this method. So we'll do a guard let to view controller equals the transition context dot view controller for a key. And the key that we're going to use here is the .to. And let's see if we can actually take a look at this. So this method is only two keys are defined by the system. Transition context to view controller and transition context from view controller. So you're basically asking for a view controller for the one that you came from or the one that you're going to. And it returns an optional, so that's why the guard let check is necessary. And so that's important. So what we'll do here is get the to and also get the from view controller. So let the from view controller equals transition context dot view controller for key. Dot from. Else we will return. And before we do the return, we're going to do one other thing. We're going to call transition context dot complete transition. And it takes a bool, did complete, true or false. So in this instance, I'm going to pass false. And if we read the documentation, it says that you must call this method after your animations have completed to notify the system that the transition animation is done. The parameter you pass must indicate whether the animation is completed successfully. And so down here, for the parameters did complete, true if the transition to the presented view controller completed, or false if the original view controller is still being displayed. So in this case, we would return false. So now we want to determine what the animation type is that we're trying to perform. So we can switch on the animation type that we had and see if it's either a present or a dismiss. So for the case of presenting, we'll do something, and for the case of dismiss, we'll do something else. So print, and we'll start off doing the present first. So what we're going to do is create two new functions, or we'll start off with one function first, and that function is going to be the actual one that's going to actually execute when we go through the present case. So we'll create a new function down below called present animation. And it's going to take a few parameters. It's going to take the context, so we'll do a present with the transition context. It's always a long UIViewControllerContextTransitioning. Such an awkward name. And the view that we want to animate. So we'll just call it view to animate, which is a UI view. And we'll start off with this function first. So what we'll do is we'll call this function for the present animation type. So present animation with. We will pass in the context. So the context is going to be the transition context. And the view that we're going to pass in is the toViewController.view, or the view controller that we are trying to present, the second screen that's about to pop up. So that's how we start. And then we'll go down here and actually implement our animation logic separately. So in the actual present animation, we're going to do, one of the first things will be clipping the bounds, and I'm going to show you what this looks like without it, and you'll understand why we need it in a moment. So we'll start off with that set to true. And for this animation, I'm going to be animating the transform, and what that basically allows us to do is, by animating the transform, we can animate properties such as the X and Y position, the size or the scale of the view, and we can also do the rotation as well if we want to. If you want to rotate a view by a particular amount of degrees, you can do that. So all of that is going to happen inside of an animation block, and that's what's going to animate the property changes that actually creates this animation. So as we go through this, we'll start off with our view to animate .transform. We're going to set that to a starting value, so CG affine transform, and that's going to be a scale. And we're going to set it to 0 and 0. Now, these are values between 0 and 1. They're percentage based. So if I want to scale a view to 75% of the width and the height of what it currently is, I can pass in values such as 0.75, so on and so forth. So that's going to be our start scale. And the next thing we're going to do is create an animation block. So UIView.animate. And you might have saw there's a little bit of a bounce to the animation. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a particular method in here. So we're going to do with duration. Let's see if I can find it, because there's so many of these. With duration using, let me see here. Come on, Xcode, help me out. I cannot read the names, but I need the one that gives me the spring, and I can't find it in this list. So this one? No, it's not. Okay, this one. UIView.animate with duration. There's a lot of properties here, so we'll unpack this one by one. So we're going to start off with our time interval, which is going to look like this. Let duration equals transition duration for our context, and the context we'll provide is the transition context. So, and if you don't know where this is coming from, this is that other method that's in here, the transition duration method that actually returns the value we injected in. So we're going to use that for our actual duration, and we'll pass in the duration here. We'll go ahead and set a delay of 0, which means do we want to wait for any animation to start first? And we don't care about that. So using Spring with damping, the values I'm going to use for this is going to be 0.80. Again, you can play with these numbers to see how much bounce you want or lack of bounce in your animation. And so you get something that you think is suitable for what you're trying to do. So for options here, I'm going to do, and there's a lot of animation options, so I'm not really going to go through all of them, but I'm going to use the curve ease in, ease out. It's kind of an even flow to the animation paths. And so for the animation block, that's where we're going to actually do our animation work, and then our completion block here is when we're done. So, and let's actually wire this up. So we've got some values in here, and the first thing I'm going to do is view to animate.transform equals cgfine transform scale x to 1.0 and 1.0 for the y. And so that's going to scale up from 0, the overall size or width and height of this view, and it's going to animate that scaling all the way up to 1.0, which is 100% of the view's width and height. And so that's exactly what we want in this situation. So in the completion block, though, there's one more step. We have to inform that we are done with our animation. So we'll tell the transition context, complete animation, did complete will pass in true. So we're done at that point. And there's one step I almost forgot here, and we want to make sure we add this or our animations will not work. And so right before we actually do the present animation, we need to add the view controller's view to the transition context's container view. And so let me just show you what this code looks like, and then we'll talk about it. So transition context dot container view, add subview to view controller dot view. And this container view is the super view of all other views during the animation sequence. So anything we want to animate on needs to be inside of this container view. So now let's head on over to that second view controller, or the one that we're going to in our animation. So in here, like I said before, I've had the basic table view and the dismiss in here, but we need a way to actually trigger this animation controller. And so what we're going to do is create an extension, and we're going to conform to the view controller's transitioning delegate. So I'm going to scroll down to the bottom here of mine and start wiring that up. So an extension on view controller 2 that conforms to this protocol UIViewControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControllerControl do a build and we'll implement the required methods. I think they might all be optional, that's fine. So we want to do animation controller for presented, let's see here, there we go, in here. And let's space this out a little bit. And so if we take a look at this, it's returning back anything that conforms to the UIViewController animated transitioning protocol. Now, if you remember here, the class we were just in, our animation controller, that is a object that conforms to this protocol. So we can return an instance of this in our view controller too and satisfy this protocol requirement in here. So if you take a look at the other parameters in here, there is the presented view controller, the presenting view controller, so on and so forth. And so for this one, I'm just going to implement the return animation controller. And I'm going to pass in a value. So I'm going to pass in 3.5 just because I think that kind of feels okay. And I'm going to do a .present for the actual animation to perform. Now there's one other step here. You have to remember this is a delegate, and who's going to act as the delegate? Well, ViewController2 is going to act as the delegate, right? So we have to assign it. So what we want to do here is just like we would do for a table view, delegate and data source, there actually is a delegate we're going to assign. So the transitioning delegate will be assigned to self. Assigned to self because ViewController2 is acting as the delegate. And if you're wondering where this property came from, if you command click on it, it's a part or a property of UIViewController. So it's just something that's there and we can plug into it when we want to. Now we're at a point where we can test our presentation logic and see if it works. So let's go ahead and fire that up in the simulator and see what it looks like. And look at that. So looks good. And you can see there's a little bit of that bounce. Now the dismiss is still the regular modal dismiss. We haven't wired up the animation for that yet. So we go back in, you see it's kind of scaling in, and there's a little bit of bounce back, and that kind of bouncy contraction, if you will, is because of that whole spring dampening function that we implemented in the animation block. So now I did make a point about the clips to bounds. I want to show you what this looks like if we turn it off. So, and why you're going to want to enable this. So let's run this again with clips to bounds commented out, and execute the transition. Now you see that if you can catch that, and let me see if I can slow it down here. I think it's Command T, yeah. So as this thing's coming out, you can see it's like spilling outside of the view controller's view, right? Especially on the image view. And as it completes the animation transition, it starts to look normal. And so that's when we say clips to bounds equals true, anything that spills outside of the allowable frame of whatever the view element is or the view controller's view will be clipped or cut off. So with slow animations on, if we turn this back on, which we want, let's take another look at that. It looks like I left that setting on. All right, so now we run it again, and you can see here, there's nothing spilling out, right? That image view is not all the way on the left and the right sides. It's contained nicely in our view controller as that animation starts to scale in. So that's exactly what we want. So I'm going to go ahead and turn slow animations off, and we'll continue with the dismiss animation next. All right, so head back over to the animation controller. Now this time we're going to go into that dismiss case and start working from there. So we can remove that print statement, and we'll create another function called dismiss animation. But before we do that, we need to do something like here, right, with our transition context. Now in this instance, I want to be a little particular about how I set this. So what I'm going to do first is, actually I'm going to copy the function here just because it's easy, and I'm going to paste that in. Now for the first one we want to paste is the to viewController.view. However, we're going to do it one more time, and we're going to change that from the to viewController to the from viewController.view. And I'll explain, we'll come back to this and talk about it more once we complete everything else. So once these are set, just like we did, we're going to create another function, func dismiss animation with transition context. I'll just copy these right on over. Okay, just like that. And we'll start working on this one now. So for this animation, it's a little bit different. It's actually a keyframe animation, and we'll get started in a similar fashion. So what we'll do here is extract the duration. So duration equals transition duration with the transition context. Just like we did from before, we're going to go ahead and basically set some transforms. So we're going to do a sequence of animations, right? We're going to scale down, and then we're going to move our view controller to the left, just completely out of sight. And so what we'll do is create a scale down transform, which is going to be a CG affine transform. And we'll do the scale X, scale Y. But instead of 0, we're going to start at 0.3. We're basically 30%. We're going to scale this thing down from 100% to 30%. And we're going to create another one called move out, which is the CG affine transform. Now this one's going to be the translation X, or basically how far left or right, or up or down, do we want to move something by? either on X or on the Y axis. So for this particular purpose, I'm going to move it by the view dot frame, or I'm sorry, the view to animate dot frame dot width, and 0 for the Y, because I want to move it left and I want to move it by a negative value, so it actually goes to the left. If I move it by a positive value, it's going to go to the right. And using the frame's width, it's pretty wide. It should be a good value to get that thing completely out of view. So that's why I'm picking that value for this particular animation. So we set those up, and then we're going to construct our animation block. And that's going to look like this. So UIView.animate keyframes. And so we'll start off with the actual duration. Now this is the overall duration for everything that's occurring inside here. And so for the delay, I'm going to use 0. For the options, I'm going to pass in dot calculate, which one was it? It was the mode linear. And I'm not going to go too much into these different options in here, but you can always read the documentation and learn a little bit more about how those affect the animations. So our animations block here and our completion block here. So I'm not going to use the value there. Before we wire up the animations, let's just format our code a little bit. We will call in our completion transient context, or transition context dot complete. Did complete set to true, so we're good there. And now we will do a little bit of work in here. And so inside of this block, we can do multiple animations. Now the key is this duration. So I'm passing in 3.5 seconds for this. That means that I need to time my animations in a particular way so they will start at a particular time and end, and then the next one can pick up at a different point in the animation chain. So to do that, we'll do a UIView.add keyframe, and the relative start time will be 0, so it's going to be right away. For the duration, I'm going to give it 0.7 seconds to do its thing, and inside of here, we'll do the animation. Now, in this case, for the view to animate, I'm going to start off by manipulating the transform, and I'm going to give it the scale down transform. So I'm going to start off by taking this thing from a 1.0 scale down to a 30% scale over 0.7 seconds at the very beginning of this keyframe animation block. So that's step 1. Now we're going to do the second animation in here. So we're going to do another keyframe block. So UIView.animate keyframes. And let's go ahead and pick our, let's see here. No, I don't want that one. I want this one. Yeah. Let's go ahead and just delete this here. And so what I'm going to change for this one is I'm going to start it a little bit later. So I'm going to pick a time, and I probably should be more intelligent with how I set the time here, but I'm going to assume I'm going to give it enough time to do what I want it to do. And I'm going to say 3.0 divided by the duration. So the relative duration, I'm going to give it 1 second to animate off of the screen here. And let's see here. Duration, like that. We'll just break these up a little bit so it's easier to read. And that's all I'm going to do there. Now, I'm going to do 2 things inside the block. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is set the transform. And I'm going to use scale down, but I'm going to combine scale down with move out. So you can concatenate your transforms to basically chain them together. So it's going to do a scale, and then it's going to use the scaled down version to translation to then translate it off the screen to the left. So that's what's going on right here. In addition to that, I'm also going to do a animation on the alpha to make it transparent. So it's going to have it's going to go from visible to not visible inside of this block. So we'll set the alpha to 0 inside of here. And so let me just format this block. shift it over a little bit. There we go. It's a little more legible. And just get that down there. And so, yeah, we're good to go here. And like I was saying, this is, we're starting 3 divided by duration. Whatever that works out to be is going to depend on the overall animation duration. And that's going to be the starting time for when this particular animation is going to occur. So if you want this animation to happen earlier, you could maybe say 2.0 or 2.5. If the overall duration was, let's say, 6 seconds, and we wanted it to start at the 4-second mark, we could do 4.0 divided by 6. But I haven't set that because I'm using 3.5. But you can manipulate these values to trigger different times you want things to start, and you can increase or decrease the relative duration as well. So we've got that hooked up, and now let's go back to UIViewController 2. And likewise, there was this for presented, there's also one for a dismiss. So func animation controller for dismissed. And here is, we're also going to return animation controller for 3.5 seconds using the dot dismiss type. And lastly, we want to make sure we call our dismiss animation back inside our switch statement. So we'll call dismiss animation with transition context and the from viewController.view. So let's go ahead and test this out in the simulator and see what everything looks like. All right, so we'll do our first presentation, and that looks good. And now we'll do our transition back. And there we go. So we're doing the first animation there to 30%, scales down, and boom, it disappears. And we can repeat that over and over and over, and it will continue to work that way. So let's go back, because I wanted to touch on one point here. Now you remember in this dismiss case here, we added the to viewController.view right before we'd added the from. Now if we comment out the 2, let's run it and see what it looks like. So we go in and we transition back. You'll see there's a black screen underneath. And then it flashes back to the actual view controller that was truly underneath, right? And that's because there's nothing in that container view. And so once the animation cycle completes, the control is returned, I guess you could say, to the view controller underneath, or whatever was presenting the view controller that was dismissed. But by adding it here, visually we can see it when the transition occurs. So by having the underneath view controller there, and we execute the transition, we go back, you can see that it's not enabled again until it finishes. So that is the reasoning behind that, to keep the the visual look and feel consistent with what we're expecting in this animation. Now, for different animations, that might not be what you want. Again, I was doing a modal present and a modal dismiss, so for my intents and purposes, that works fine. But for your case, you may want to play with it. You may want to put a different view underneath. You may not want anything at all. It totally depends on what you're trying to do. So just keep that in mind when you structure these kinds of things. This was ad hoc more for this kind of modal present and dismiss style of animations. But as you see, you can do pretty much anything you want in the context of animations. There's a lot of options at play, especially with keyframe animations. That's where you can really start to tinker with a totally custom UI and experience for your users that these stock and standard animations just don't provide. And that wraps up this tutorial. So hopefully now you have some more tools in the tool belt that you can use to create really cool animations and user interactions in your app. And now you understand this is the foundational block for how a lot of these apps build these fancy effects into their apps. So if you like this video, you know what to do. Go ahead and smash that like button. Consider subscribing to CodePro to stay up to date for all the latest tutorials. Make sure you follow CodePro on Facebook, on Twitter, on Skillshare, and on Udemy. And also you can support me on Patreon as well. You can find my link down below in the description. And let me know in the comments section down below What apps have you seen that are doing a lot of these really custom animations? Maybe you can try and recreate a lot of those effects using some of the concepts you learned from this tutorial. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I will catch you in the next one.